Thank you very much. As we always do, we had a really happy morning set up for you. We did the drug use and the opioids, and here's how whacked out everyone is, and then we did the mentally ill clients. And now we're going to jump right into domestic violence. And don't worry, this afternoon you still have child abuse and neglect coming. So we are happy to again welcome Steve Everts, who presents so often for this seminar, and it's very much appreciated. And Steve, come on up.
Good morning. Yes, I did recognize the upbeat tenor of the morning program and thought I was going to participate along with everybody else in that. We're talking today about presenting the domestic violence case in court. I use the word domestic violence because that's the word that's used in the statute. Keep in mind that under most social and psychological studies that have been done today, the word intimate partner violence is the correct terminology. The written materials that we have are found on pages 65 through 135 of Book 1. They cover a variety of different subjects, which I'll just trigger for you. You can read them on your own. There's some recent stats on domestic violence, different ways that family lawyers may come into contact with domestic violence. There's a step-by-step analysis of 25403.03. We address the age-old problem of the he said, she said issue when we go to hearings on domestic violence. There's a summary of what's called Form 4C of the Arizona Rules of, yes, criminal procedure. A summary of 4 recent DV cases from the Court of Appeals in 2018. Some random lessons or tips that I've picked up just from my own cases over the last several years. And a dozen attachments, which I specifically put together so that you'd have a resource to use for counseling clients or others with regard to domestic violence issues. They include a chart of the crimes that are defined as domestic violence, the ABA Domestic Violence Safety Plan, specialized help for victims of DV over the age of 50, specialized help for victims of DV with pets, help for persons who actually commit the acts of domestic violence, some crisis numbers, and an order of protection flowchart. I also included some references if you want to use them for articles that you may find of interest to help educate you on the subject of domestic violence, which I've had to use or experts have had to use from time to time in connection with their cases. So let's begin with a video.
Standing emergency.
My mommy just having a fight.
Is she getting
I'm talking to the police, mommy. Stop it! My baby! Stop it! Can you get to the police, please?
Okay, we're going to be there. What's going on?
They're having a fight because this has been going on forever and ever.
How's he hurting her?
He made some red marks on mommy.
Where did he make the red marks on?
Her neck. Oh my God!
What's the matter? Is your Hello?
I can't listen to that without getting emotional every time I hear it. I've probably listened to it a dozen times over the last month. It reminds me that it's not only your client. It's not only the adverse party. It's the children that we have to think about in domestic violence cases. My first contact with DV occurred in October of 1998. I was asked to pro tem for then Commissioner Linda Miles in downtown Phoenix. That was back in the day when we could pro tem by being asked by the court. We didn't have to wait for somebody to ask us that was on court administration. She asked me if I would come down and handle the calendar, so I did that. I had to learn a lot about defaults before I ended up showing up there that day. But when I got there was a lady and a man who came into the courtroom. The lady said she wanted to dismiss her case because she had decided that she and her husband could reconcile and save their marriage. So I quizzed them for a few minutes if they knew what they were really doing and the consequences of making that choice, and they left happily, hand in hand, out of the courtroom. The next day, Amy, Commissioner Miles' commissioner, called me and said, "Did you hear the news?" I said, "No." She said, "Are you aware of what happened to two of the people in the courtroom yesterday?" I said, "No." She said, "Well, apparently the police are going to call you because after they left, the lady went back to the apartment of her boyfriend to tell him she was reconciling with her husband. And when she got there, he killed her, and then he took his own life." That wasn't my first encounter with domestic violence, and it hasn't been my last. In the late 2000s, I was going to a trial in front of Judge Goss out at Southeast. When I showed up at the cafeteria an hour ahead, like we do when we want to meet with our clients a little bit before the trial begins, my client didn't show up. And I knew something was wrong because he was an engineer, and you know engineers, how time-consuming and detail-oriented they are. He was never late for an appointment in my office in the history of our representation. Nevertheless, I knew something was wrong, so I went in the courtroom, and Judge Goss was kind enough to hear me. And I said, "I think there's a problem, but I don't know why." He said, "Okay." I said, "I need to call and have a home check done." So he allowed me to do that, and we stopped the trial for a few minutes. While that went on, we were waiting, and his wife bolted through the back two doors of the courtroom into the courtroom and said, "Where's Robert?" Which was kind of a strange expression for a person who comes to get divorced from that person, and she was late. Well, I got the call a few minutes later from the police, and he was found dead on the floor of his home with knife wounds throughout his body, lethal drugs being administered, and a cord wrapped around his neck hanging. I will promise there are people in this audience who've been the victims of domestic violence. Some may have even committed it. I, like some of you, experienced domestic violence in my family growing up. My dad was a really good man. And I got to tell him I loved him before he died in 1977 and made up with him. But during our home life, he was a terrible alcoholic. I used to go around the house and find the fifths of vodka hiding under the sofa cushions, in the garbage cans, under the car seats, wherever they were located. And one time confiscated enough to fill up an entire old-fashioned garbage can to throw it in the trash. The worst traumatic experience I can remember was when my mother and my younger brother and I were chased down the street with a loaded shotgun. You are going to see, if you haven't already seen it, a lot of domestic violence cases, particularly now. Statistics that are listed in the materials are all there. I just wanted to mention a couple of points. DV deaths have seen a slight decrease over the last few years. But I want to mention that it doesn't matter. Even one death from domestic violence is too many, as far as I'm concerned. DV crosses all races, all genders, all ages, all cultures. However, it is statistically true that women often suffer more serious injuries and death than do men. I got the recent stats from the court to ask them about domestic violence. I try and accumulate those about every year or two. Do you know that there are over 51 orders of protection issued every single working day in the state of Arizona Superior Courts? There are also an additional 51 or so every working day issued out of Maricopa County Municipal and Justice Court. So I ask you, if there's over 100 people that are out getting orders of protection every day in our court system, how many more are there at home that did not go get an order of protection? Unless you're living in a cave you undoubtedly have recognized a great cultural shift over the last few years. These are just a few of the many faces we see on the news regularly. This is a common trend and more common in our practices than ever before. Let me just highlight a couple of things that have happened recently. You all know about the #MeToo movement. ASU offers now a certification program in domestic violence, and soon you'll see community courses in community campuses across the state. October was deemed Domestic Violence Awareness Month throughout the United States. Victims of domestic violence can now terminate their landlord-tenant agreements early under ARS 33-1318. I don't know if you knew that. I did not. Police departments across the state are now using Form 4C of the Arizona Rules of Criminal Procedure when interviewing domestic violence victims, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So you'll see many new trends today. So how do we as family lawyers come in contact with domestic violence? We all know the easy ways. The initial consultation is the most common. We do it when we go to temporary orders. We do it when we go to trial. We do it when we go to order of protection hearings. We have a variety of methods. We also can do it as victims. I've had to have at least 5 injunctions against harassment over the last 15 years from opposing parties, and even one, the wife of my own client, who I couldn't stand to have contact me or our office. I'll bet probably half of this audience has had some contact with either Craig or Rhonda Cerny along the way. A couple of years ago, I represented Craig Cerny in connection with his case. We were doing a post-decree enforcement action. While I was representing him, we had a settlement conference out in East Valley, and shortly after that, his ex-wife went to his home, grabbed the weapon out of the kitchen, and shot him in the chest. In a recent Court of Appeals memo decision, the court held that his non-modifiable spousal maintenance agreement of $8,000 per month was, in fact, just that, non-modifiable. However, the court did go on to note that any equitable defenses regarding the shooting could be raised in the enforcement action later filed by his ex-wife. In May of 2018, while the appeal was pending, Judge Fox held a hearing and found that wife had unclean hands and therefore could not enforce the order. Wow, thank goodness somebody had a head on their shoulders. He was also awarded attorney's fees, Craig was. In December, the Court of Appeals dismissed the wife's appeal for lack of jurisdiction. Now, I'm not suggesting that if a man wants to modify his non-modifiable spousal maintenance, he needs to suggest that his wife go out and shoot him in the chest. But that is an interesting twist on Waldron, which I assume, Todd, where are you? You were back there a little while ago. Is probably going to talk about that someplace today. So let's talk about 25-40303. For some reason, I have had a heck of a time trying to wrap my head around this statute because of the way in which it is drafted. So I tried to set forth for you in the materials an analysis step by step of 25-403.03. Before I gave it, when I submitted it to Shannon, I didn't have the opportunity before the holidays to do what I really wanted to do, and that was draft a flowchart, because to me that's the way to best understand the statute. And so I did do that after I got back from a trip a few days ago, and I prepared a flowchart for you so that you can see it. It's on the stand outside, or it might be in the electronic materials, I was told. So hopefully you can take a look at that. But let's just go through it for just a minute, because I think it helps clarify that. By the way, I'm not sure I'm the only one that's had trouble with this statute from what I talked to some of my colleagues. First thing you have to ask is, was there an act of domestic violence? And of course that's defined under the 25-403 standard, as well as under the criminal statute on 13-3601 and 13-705. And be sure and remember the Engstrom case that came out just a year ago now defined what domestic violence was. Of course, if there isn't an act of domestic violence, you don't have a case, so you don't have to worry about it. If there is, you have to ask the next question, and was the domestic violence significant, or is there a significant history of domestic violence? That is now found in the Brumley case that was just issued in 2018, May. It's in your materials, and you might be able to find an interesting explanation of the 3 criteria that are used to determine the significant factor. If it is not significant, then there's still a rebuttable presumption against sole or joint legal decision-making. Of course, the presumption doesn't apply if both parents have committed an act of DV, but to rebut the presumption, the perpetrator must comply with the subsection E factors. That's also under Brumley, and that was a successful case where a father actually put forth and met the factors so that he was entitled to have equal parenting time, if I recall correctly. Of course, if the domestic violence is significant, you can't award joint legal decision-making at all. Then the statute goes into a discussion about the parenting time, which is somewhat different than what it is with regard to legal decision-making. But remember, of course, the burden of proof is on the parent who committed the DV to prove that parenting time will not endanger the child or significantly impair the child's emotional development. There's another case in 2018 in your materials, which I summarized, called the Houchon case, which addresses that particular factor. So you might make a note of that. And I do want to bring to your attention that in all cases, whether we have significant, whether we don't, whether the presumption's been rebutted, or we're talking about parenting time, in all cases, the court considers the policy factors that DV is contrary to the best interests of the child, the safety and well-being of the child and the victim are of primary importance, and a perpetrator's history of causing or threatening to cause physical harm to another person under subsection B is a factor to consider. Note, that's any person. It doesn't say the child or a parent. So any history may be relevant. So those are the things that I would consider, or at least have helped me in trying to make heads or tails out of 25403.03 as you're going through it. One of the biggest problems that we face as practitioners is the age-old he said, she said problems. Who is telling the truth, right? Don't think that just because the victim is not able to have a police report, a medical report, a photograph, or a recording, that they aren't telling the truth. In the AFCC materials, which I've summarized for you and which I've referenced, there are at least 16 reasons why the victims of domestic violence do not report the domestic violence. And you see this almost every day in your practice if you deal in this area at all. So something that I thought might be helpful, and what I've tried to use and take from hints, the cases I've done, what do we do to maximize or minimize the credibility of the victim? And what do we do to maximize or minimize the credibility of the perpetrator? So I've given you a list of several pages of just ideas that I've had or that I've seen used, and that might be some benefit to you. Someday I wish if we had these, when we have these conferences, we could have a Q&A period or a roundtable where we all contributed everything that we've ever learned in these cases, because I could make that list probably 100 pages long after you guys all contributed, because you're a lot smarter than I am when it comes to this stuff. So you could also give us some great hints. So I don't pretend to be the expert on all of it. But I thought I'd mention a few things that I think are kind of helpful for us with regard to how to maximize and minimize. First of all, as a young lawyer, I did civil jury practice. And my two mentors were great. And they taught me one valuable lesson about trial work. And that was, when it comes to credibility, it's the details that matter. That'll be what determines whether they're lying or whether they're telling the truth. So make sure you consider the details whenever you are doing your direct or cross-examination. I mean that for both, even on your own client if you're the victim or the perpetrator. Make sure they know the details for both your direct and for cross. Check that gun, check that knife, look at that door. Check whatever you need to do to make sure. I went to the police department in a case we had this past year and actually looked at the gun, because I wanted to make sure and find out what was the strobe, what was the laser, how did it work, and had the police demonstrate it for me. So when we get into trial, we know what the gun does. My experience has taught me, maybe different than yours, but life has different teaching experiences for each of us, I'm sure. But it has taught me that victims of domestic violence remember every single detail of the DV. And they don't only remember it for a year, they remember it for 40 years, or 50 years, or whatever it takes. So somewhere they will tell you that they know those. What about a domestic violence expert? Sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes it's not. Depends on cost, of course, and whether you have the resources to do it. But make sure that they either meet with or have the opportunity to meet with the opposing party if you're going to use one. I had 2 cases with DV experts this past year. Both of them hinged on whether or not they actually interviewed or gave the opportunity to be interviewed to the other party. So make sure you take advantage of that when you do it. Also, give them all the information. Make sure they've read Engstrom. Make sure they know the criminal statute and the 25403 factors. If they haven't, teach them, because they need to know that, or else their testimony will be either limited or inadmissible. What about polygraph tests? We had a case this past year where it was used in one of our cases, and they're perfectly fine for either side, but remember, they're inadmissible in Arizona unless it's by stipulation of both parties. So if it's being used against you and it wasn't by stipulation, you file a motion in limine. If you wanted to use it, then make sure you get the opposing party to admit or agree to it before you do it so that it can be used into evidence. Form 4C. In April of 2018, the Arizona Supreme Court adopted Rule 4C of the Arizona Rules of Criminal Procedure, which now authorizes the police to ask the victim of domestic violence a series of 2-tier questions, 7 in Tier 1 and 12 in Tier 2, about domestic violence. And it's an outgrowth of what you may have heard as the danger assessment in Arizona, where they try and determine how serious is the danger of the alleged perpetrator in this particular case. I'm not going to spend time going through the questions. You can look at them and read the form. It's all in there. But the point for us is, when you subpoena that police report, make sure you see if there is a Form 4C with it. And you can use it either side, either for the victim or for the perpetrator. Last but not least, I've made a list of some of the random lessons and thoughts that I've had as I've learned in these cases. I've made a couple of notes of some of them, which I'll bring to your attention. When you're using a photograph, make sure you know what the photograph has in it. This photograph is one that was used in a case against me. It was a husband alleging that the wife had committed an act of domestic violence against him. And he admitted, as one of a number of photographs, this particular photograph. Notice the fingernail in the middle of the photograph. I asked him if this was him and his body, and he said, yes, that's the injury she caused on my abdomen. Well, I knew I had a 16-year-old that was going to be able to testify, and in this particular case, the judge in Southeast allowed me to have the minor come into the courtroom. In fact, he insisted she come into the courtroom. And I asked her, whose fingernail is that? She said, it's mine. Whose body is that? It's mine. She was involved in an automobile accident 30 days before the alleged domestic violence, and the seatbelt caused striations across her abdomen. Importance to know your evidence when you present it. It's always great when you get a chuckle out of the judge about the opposing side's evidence, isn't it? That's always fun. Remember that guilty pleas can be used because they assume all the facts and the elements of the crime are in them if you're trying to prove them. Okay, last slide. Maybe. This is a young woman who took photographs of herself every day for a year. That sign says, "Help me. I don't know if I'll make it to tomorrow." So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, DV is more pervasive than we think. DV is longer lasting than we think. DV causes more problems than we think. It's more serious than we think. In your practice, you may be the only person that can help somebody. So let's make it count. Thank you.